Phil Booth is a multi-award winning campaigner and privacy and identity advocate. He's central to several human rights and digital rights related organisations, including Privacy International, the Foundation for Information Policy Research, and Med Confidential. From 2004 to 2011, Phil led the non-partisan No to ID campaign, where he successfully campaigned to defeat the introduction of ID cards and other database state initiatives. Since 2013, Phil's coordinated Med Confidential, which campaigns for confidentiality and consent in health social care, seeking to ensure that every flow of data across and around the UK's NHS and wider care system is consensual, safe and transparent. Big tech and policymakers talk about ethics in this area, but is it mainly distraction? Will words turn into actions and change culture, laws, and perhaps most importantly, code? Let's hear from Phil now.
Hi there, good evening, good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thanks for joining my talk. I hope you've been enjoying the forum like I have these past few days. There's been some really fascinating deep dives and there's been such a rich array of speakers to learn from. I'm very honoured to be part of this and a part of the ongoing discussion. One thing that has come out for me through the forum is the sheer complexity of what we're all talking about and dealing with. And this is something which I grapple with and think a lot about in my work with large-scale, complex socio-technical systems like those of the NHS and care system. Also, the Department of Work and Pensions Universal Credit System, which we scrutinise and analyse as an example of a digital welfare state, not to mention a whole parade of identity systems. But there's also an explosion of technologies going on, from biometrics and machine learning, deep learning, GANs, AI, and looming large, right now in the pandemic, genomics, which is beginning to surface. And of course, there's oodles and oodles and oodles of big data. So much as we might like to tear stuff up and start afresh, I'm certainly a pragmatist. There is no clean slate. We are where we are, and especially with the sort of critical life-supporting systems that I work around, we must and do work with path availabilities, what Med Confidential likes to call available next steps. There's a note of caution I have to sound about shiny new digital things. They aren't always as straightforward as they may seem, and we must be very careful as we automate that we aren't just taking a paper-based or a human-based process into a digital system that can harm or even kill people. I'll give you a quick example of that. So a few years back, some bright sparks in the NHS built a shiny new service. It was all lovely, clean design, neat and simple, and it allowed you to register with a GP practice online, a general practice online. They showed it off quite proudly until we asked, so what happens when you register with a GP? They seemed puzzled, because obviously that was the point of the thing, until we pointed out that in the NHS, when you register with a GP, a new GP, you deregister from your existing GP. So what they just created is a tool that with someone's name, a postcode, an NHS number, would allow a malicious actor to cut them off from their medication and from their ongoing care and just throw them somewhere random in the rest of the country. So digital done wrong can, certainly in my bit of the world, kill people. And far too often we are talking about or things in terms of just the tech and the data, and far too little about the human beings. But going back to the complexity, sorry, there are no simple answers to all of this complexity, but there are certain things that we've learned over the past several years that can help make what needs to be done clear, or at least clearer. So I'll take you on a little tour of some of the challenges and lessons we've tackled, some of the lessons we've learned over the last several years, and hopefully provide some generalizable perspectives, maybe even a few proto principles for tackling data under information processing at scale. So, as the introduction kindly said, I've been working at Med Confidential now for about 8 years, but I did begin to pick up on some work in health when I was still at No2ID in our database state work on around 2006. In fact, we actually set up Med Confidential when some doctors who I previously worked with got in touch and said, could we look at this new piece of legislation, something called the Health and Social Care Act 2012, because some clauses that were buried in that act, so the law, looked like they created the basis for a mass data grab of everyone in England's GP record. Now, it turns out they and we weren't wrong, but I'll get to that in a bit. First, though, in health, I want to unpack why the work that we're doing isn't just simply privacy. In health, as in law and in some other contexts, what we're talking about here is more confidentiality, something subtly different. You don't really have a choice. Privacy about controlling who you share your information with. With health, you don't really have a choice but to share potentially really sensitive, possibly even embarrassing information with a medical professional who may themselves need to share that with other people. When you turn up for direct care, consent is implied. So what you really need is trust. And this is helped to be manifested by the medical profession with their professional and legal duties of the doctor. They've got a duty of care, they have a duty of confidence, and it's what lies at the very heart of the doctor-patient relationship if it's going to work and keep you well and keep you alive. But how does this confidentiality thing manifest itself around data and in the digital domain? And that was the challenge we had initially with Med Confidential. How do we frame that? So the formulation we came up with to provide what we believe is absolutely necessary to preserve the trust that you need in a health system was that every use of data is consensual, safe, and transparent. Now, that sounds fine, sounds noble even. Some people thought we were crazy, but it was nowhere near to being true when we started. Bit by bit, over the subsequent 8 years or so, and still going, 2 steps forward, 1 step back sometime, we are getting there. So we've got those 3 words, consensual, safe, and transparent. What do they mean in practice? So by consensual, we don't just mean consent, that thing which a lot of people make the mistake of sort of using. They go, oh, look, GDPR says we've got to get consent. Because while fully informed, explicit prior consent is both desirable and necessary in some circumstances, in health in particular, it's not always possible. There's implied consent for many sorts of direct care. There's delegated consent for those people who are incapable of giving consent themselves. Either they're too young, or they don't have the mental capacity, or they're unconscious. And for many of the uses that we have of data in the NHS, what's used is dissent, not consent. That's an opt-out, if you like, rather than opt-in. But the point is that people should always have a choice. And in order to exercise that choice, they should know about it and the consequences of it. And of course, that choice must be respected. So going back to that GP data grab that we talked about, that did surface about a year after we set up Med Confidential. It was something called care.data, and it turned into an enormous scandal and outcry. We created a form that patients could use to deploy an opt-out to keep their data locked at their GP practice so it wouldn't be extracted away. And hundreds of thousands of people used that in the months that when this first came to public attention. And I just checked the figures, and the last figures were given, about 2 million people or so have used this. So a couple of pence, 2.5% maybe of the country have actually exercised this opt-out. Unfortunately, it wasn't just that new project. Stuff had been going on that was bad as well. And the old Health and Social Care Information Centre, where all of the information from around the NHS is generally held centrally, it'd been doing really quite bad things like allowing the Home Office and police to have access to information about patients from their medical records or NHS records, and very controversially selling data, copies of the data, the hospital histories, the linked individual level patient hospital history. So like, a line of data on every event. Yeah, they've been selling them to commercial companies. So the law was changed. That body has changed its practices, and it itself had to offer another opt-out. So because the data that they have wasn't all stuff that had come from GP practices, it came from hospitals and other places. You had an opt-out you could exercise there. That was updated when GDPR came in, and that is now the national data opt-out. Yeah, that should be something which everybody across the whole of the NHS respects. Unfortunately, the deadline for that was last March, and of course, COVID intervened. But we need to get that sorted. So there's still quite a lot of work to do on the consensual part there, but we also have to, very importantly, preserve the line between what is data used for direct care, for actually treating people, providing them healthcare, and what are called secondary uses, a whole bunch of things that get done with patients' data, but which aren't actually for their own care. And that's the stuff that we hear talked about in terms of innovation from government ministers and trade ministers, from people like Dominic Cummings, and certainly from big tech and big pharma and big DNA. But there are other uses like planning and commissioning, things that they're using to run bits of the NHS, choosing which things to commission and decommission. And of course, very importantly, research, legitimate, ethical research. And Med Confidential believes and continues to believe there need be no conflict between good care, good research, and good ethics. Now, I won't dwell overly long on the safe bit of the triad, except to note that we chose the word safe and the meanings around safe over merely just secure. Safe for us is a much higher bar. The model that we proposed to Parliament back in 2014 was something called a safe setting, like the Office for National Statistics uses for holding all of the raw census data, which in the UK we're about to do another census, and also the business microdata, which they use to generate national statistics. So if you don't know it already, there's something called the 5 safes model. The idea is essentially that you have safe people from safe organizations who are authorized and accountable. You have safe projects which get approvals, maybe from a research ethics committee. You have the safe setting itself, which is more than just the sort of technical, but the operational sort of way in which everything is held and managed, the architecture around the data. You keep the data as safe as you can. That doesn't mean it will be completely anonymous, but you may well do things like pseudonymize it, replace some of the obvious identifiers with a jumble of letters or numbers that conceal that particularly highly identifying item. And of course, and most importantly, you look for safe outputs. And by that, we mean when the data or anything leaves this safe setting, it is has had rigorous statistical disclosure controls applied to it. It is like statistics, and it cannot identify anyone. What you don't do, which is still going on a bit, and in certain places, is actually send out copies of the data itself. So finally, in this triad, we've got transparent. This is critical, and it's actually one of the most often overlooked parts of the equation. It seems odd to me, because without transparency and without evidence, what's the basis for trust? The philosopher Dame Honora O'Neill said it's pretty pointless to simply ask, can I trust someone? Or for a company or for a government to simply say, trust us. I pretty much agree. Instead, we have to ask, and it's on those who wish to use our data to show whether they are competent, whether they're honest, and whether they're reliable. I happen to think in these pretty divisive times, there may be, in terms of trust, we may need something about, do we share common values, or do we believe we share those? But I'll set that aside for now. So it's on these bodies, these organizations, governments, whatever, the NHS, to prove that they are trustworthy. Yeah? And this is true even and especially when they make mistakes. If they won't tell you what they're doing, or who's doing it, or who's profiting from it, then they're not being transparent. And they're certainly not being ethical on that basis. And as we have found, medical intellectuals got into a number of these sort of situations, they may be breaking the law. We found companies like Google DeepMind processing the data of 1.6 million patients of the Royal Free Hospital, and turns out they were doing so unlawfully. Yeah. So how do we know? In the NHS, we propose something we call data usage reports. This is very much like you would understand your mobile phone or your bank statement, but instead of showing you your minutes or your pennies and pounds, it would show who has accessed your data. Now that sounds quite complicated, except that every modern and certainly newly commissioned system will have such audit information built into it. Yeah, every competent system anyway, any system that the NHS is doing. And I think we should be increasingly demanding this for all of the systems to which we are exposed. Yeah. So that audit information, who has looked at your information, can be fed back in the NHS. This can be fed back via the NHS app or NHS login on NHS UK. And you can see where your records have been accessed from, and if something untoward, if it's from a place you've never been treated or something, then you are able to follow it up because you're the person most affected by that access or use or misuse of your data. These data usage reports, obviously also because you created a channel between the institution and the individual, they allow you to sort of do a whole bunch of other things, assist the other bits, if you like. So you can feed back on research that's been done. You can offer opportunities to volunteer, to opt in to specific sorts of research if you say you're happy for that to happen. Or when things do go wrong, you can actually be told. So when there's a data breach, for example, and the NHS, like everyone else, suffers from breaches, those who've been affected can be told what the NHS is doing about it, what they may need to do about it. And importantly, those who have not been affected can be definitively told that they haven't been. So to close the loop up, if you like, these data usage reports, because you've got that channel of communication, can also be used to refresh consent. Yeah? The transparency feeds into the informed consent piece. So that's why we got these three, and they go round and round and round and round, and it's a virtuous cycle. So those words unpacked into what has been a number of operationalizable initiatives, systems that needed to be built, flags that need to be set within systems, and functions that needed to be communicated to the public. Thinking and moving on from medicine, which has obviously got a long history, possibly one of the longest histories of doing ethics, from Hippocrates' first do no harm through to modern professional ethics, registered medical professionals who can be struck off, literally prohibited from practicing medicine for breaching an ethical code, is something we just don't see in other contexts as much. There's a lot of companies at the moment, big tech companies, putting out lists of ethical principles. That's all fine. But which of them are actually proposing that there be some level of sanction that people can be struck off for building bad code? Yeah? There's a similarity in research ethics. They maybe haven't been around as long, but they do actually hold, by and large, and across in some interesting places. So, for example, there was a guy in China who actually edited the genes of 2 babies, and absolutely shunned by the research community. Unacceptable, even in China. So we have this situation. You can't stop any particular person from doing something, but you can actually make it something that's clearly unethical. So what do we want? We want these maybe principles to be more real than that. They need to be manifested in your products, your services, your company's business model, its policies, and that they have actual consequences, and that those consequences can be known. So every digital system, by definition, is processing data. It can provide at least some of the evidence of what it is doing. And in this context, I'll talk about a bit of work that we'll be looking at, or another area, which is Her Majesty's courts and tribunals systems. It was actually Dr. Natalie Byram of the Legal Education Foundation who did an excellent analysis and review of the court system, in which, amongst other things, she identified the 13 fields of data that were required to show evidence that the courts were meeting their public sector duties, their obligations under the UK's Equality Act. So that's 13 pieces of information that would establish if people with protected characteristics, ethnicity, gender stuff, were being discriminated against. It's the measure of the bias within the justice system. Critically, however, and I'll remind you of that GP registration example that I spoke about right at the outset, when you translate this sort of thing into the digital domain, into the systems of the courts and tribunals, you can't simply take those pieces of data from the operational flows, the flows of data that are being used to deliver justice. Just because it's there, because it's in a system, doesn't mean you can go digging into it. And this is a mistake that many people make. That would be utterly toxic to trust, utterly, and also the confidentiality and integrity of the justice system. This is a secondary use. This is monitoring the performance of the system, not delivering justice, and so you have to approach it in a certain way. You need to engineer a solution, and it's not actually that hard. You probably thought of it already. You build the digital equivalent of that entirely voluntary sheet that you've probably filled in your job applications before, where you declare your ethnicity and other things. That sheet is extracted from the pack that's given to the interview panel. It's a sample. It's a way to look at the performance of what's the whole interview process, but without actually influencing it. You've got to keep that separation. Just because we've got huge systems with large amounts of data in it, we need to think a lot more about functional segregation for different purposes if we want to be ethical about what it is that we're doing. And of course, if you abstract that stuff out in that way, it's totally separate. They can be statistics. They can be published. In fact, there must be, to show where the system is failing or falling short in its public duties and where it must be changed. And again, critically, to join that circle up, if you keep publishing this stuff, we can see the results of the changes that you've made to see if they're effective or not. So, automating for equality in justice turns out to be, sample some data in a very careful way and make sure that, the things that you are looking at actually, show that you are meeting your lawful obligations. And then this brings me to AI. We did have this big fight with DeepMind, as I mentioned, over its illegal use of patients' data. And forgive me, I have to say, if I'm skeptical of things like ethics board, because they've got a secret ethics board. Google had a more public ethics board that blew up. And when we wrote to the partnership on AI, they never even replied when we told them that one of their founders had broken the law. Yeah. However, I want to focus on the transparency and evidence piece and pull together a few themes and be really, really clear here. I'm not talking about AI explainability. I'm just talking about things that we could and should be doing now. So much as I've talked about the data usage reports that tell you how your data has been used, for AI models, when they're being trained, especially on sensitive personal data like health data in the NHS, we should be doing something that which Med Confidential calls analysis and input reports, so that throughout the entire life cycle of a model that's being used to either diagnose maybe eventually or assist in certain processes in the delivery of care, throughout the entire life cycle of that model, we can know what data set was used to train it, what version of what model was used, so we actually have, if you like, that sort of auditable and certifiable assurance of what's going on. And those who are procuring AI systems, especially for life-critical functions, should be required to have this information and to make it publicly available. No more hiding dodgy data sets. Where the data came from originally is actually important in ethics, in ethical terms, and it may well be vital in legal terms. And as more sophisticated analyses become available on the performance of the outcomes of running a particular model, then those should be wrapped in as well. So we need to build towards a situation where you start off with certification and maybe have sector and industry standards. We may need to have particular laws to require people to publish stuff, but the laws that already exist aren't being properly used. And the law that's most important, or the framework that's most important, I think, is the human rights framework. You should be compliant with that. It's not just data protection. It's not just GDPR. It's not just your public sector equality duties. If you want to do ethics, or if you want to be ethical, you need to go a lot further than just mere legal compliance. A lot of people seem to think that this somehow starts and finishes with GDPR. But that's the law and the rule of law, data protection law, and the law in general are there as the foundation. Clearly, there are some people who can't even stay within it, and those who try to redefine it or interpret it to their own benefit aren't being ethical. If you want to be ethical, do no harm is a start. But in the world of complexity that we now live in, I think you have to aim a lot higher. Designed to support and to promote human rights. And that's all of them, not just the ones that suit your business model, like free speech and Facebook. And you must engineer into your systems and processes the functionalities that can provide the evidence that you are actually doing so. Don't ask us to trust you. Demonstrate that you are trustworthy. And if you won't hold yourself to a higher standard and be willing to prove it, then why should we consider you ethical? I see there's a whole bunch of questions come in, and we have about 15 minutes. So I will try to answer some of these as we're coming up. So there's a question: how much of an issue is big corporations using ethical language as a PR tool as opposed to really being ethical? Well, I would say this is a massive problem. We've seen around the world dozens, if not over 140 or more at the last count of ethical principles being issued. But how do we know, and how can the people issuing these ones be tested against their statements? Ethics, unfortunately, looks like it has become a way to distract from maybe even talking about the lawfulness of what's going on. Is a way to sort of shift the conversation away from regulation a bit and say, oh well, we need to be talking about ethics. And a question that sort of seems to follow on from that a bit is it dangerous for massive companies to appear human and friendly on social media? I don't know. I mean, it's anything that isn't a human, actually a human being, I think should be clearly identified as such. We are finding many of our interactions these days are with things that pretend to be human, maybe chatbots or what have you. Certainly some sort of the AI-driven bits. And many people may actually be fooled, and that's only going to get worse as time goes on. I mean, you may even have things like deepfakes. So not just seeing some text in a box or hearing something, but seeing something that pretends to be human. I think that's a very difficult line. If something is being generated or media is being communicated in that way, and the person or the corporation that is trying to communicate does not or is not willing to identify that they're using a bot or something, again, that's something which I think is pretty clearly stepping over a line on ethics. So there's a question on, is patient data not key to advancing medicine and treatments? When people opt out, are they aware of the impact doing this might also have? Yes, I mean, absolutely. As we say, we see no conflict between the ethical and lawful use of data and doing good research. In reality, the majority of the research that we're talking about here with this sort of big data that's gathered, so not the clinical trials so much as things that are done with sort of large data sets, like everyone who's admitted to a particular hospital with a particular condition or set of symptoms or something like that. That sort of information en masse provides a great resource for research. But proper research, good, legitimate, well-constructed research, is perfectly capable of handling the sort of size of hole, if you like, in the data that people opting out would create. As I said, maybe 2 million people have opted out of having the data extracted from their GP record, and that doesn't prevent a whole bunch of absolutely fine research from being done. As we move more towards, I think, this sort of safe setting approach, where the data we know is in a much safer place, rather than being sent out, copies of it all being sent out places, then I think probably more people are likely to opt back in. But until that's true, people need to be able to protect that information. Then there's a question about how can transparency exist in deep learning? If we find ways to explain the results, is transparency fulfilled or not? And at the end, deep learning in healthcare is mostly a privacy issue or a danger to ruin patient-doctor trust. So this is a very tricky one, and this is absolutely something which, at the moment, the NHS is beginning to struggle with or to deal with. During the pandemic, there has been a project called the National COVID Chest Imaging Database constructed, which is about 16 hospitals pooling their CT scans, MRI scans, X-rays, so that they can be available for research and development, actually, of some models around, obviously looking at the lungs, because COVID is a predominantly respiratory disease in the first instance. Now, that's about, as it turns out, about 8,000 patients scans in that database, and there's about half a dozen or so projects, I think, being done, maybe a bit more. But it is still the case that no AI model has been validated for clinical use. Yeah? There are a lot of people out there claiming, "Hey, I've got some AI, a chatbot." Babylon Health, for example, says they've got a chatbot and they've got an AI that's better than a doctor. Such claims fall apart when you just actually interact with its chatbot and it doesn't even recognise the symptoms of a heart attack or an impending heart attack. Yeah, there are a lot of claims about this, but we actually need to come up with ways. Like I was saying, we are actually developing analyses, ways to look at how we test what an AI or a deep learning model, machine learning model is actually doing. What we have got is some machine learning that works for a particular hospital trust's demographics. Yeah, so literally, it's okay. We can use it here because we know it's operating within the parameters for the population that we are actually serving. But at this point, the NHS still won't, validate it to then go and use it in a different part of the country where the demographics are different. It's that subtle. So I think we need to, as I say, develop this transparency piece. We need to start with certification and just literally say, look, how did you build this thing? What data do you put into it? And then build up the sophistication of the analyses, which I think are going to be a whole bunch of different methods. And here's another question. I completely agree with Phil that ethics needs to go beyond law and expand to human rights. Does an ethical approach also need to be a decolonial one? Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the human rights framework, as I understand it, and I work with it, it's all about not differentiating at all. Yeah, you have human rights by virtue of being a human being, not a tree. Yeah, and while it has within it, protections against rights that protect you from being discriminated against and this and that and the other, that should apply across all cultures. So if you come at it from a historical colonial perspective, as or an exceptionalist or a nationalist perspective, you aren't doing it right. As simple as that. So, for example, a lot of obviously technology, a lot of data, a lot of digital stuff is heavily in the West is heavily US biased. Well, it's coming from an environment where they have a constitution that had to be amended to put a Bill of Rights in it, and which doesn't actually exist under the same sorts of human rights frameworks that we've had since the Second World War and over in Europe, as originally the UN Declaration on Human Rights and then European Convention on Human Rights. Yeah, when you look at these things, they are very, very carefully designed because some of those rights are in tension. Yeah? If you start to say, well, we're not going to apply it to this, or we're going to apply it from a perspective of, how the world used to be, and with assumptions which can lead, as we tragically, terrifyingly seen, assumptions of white supremacy or male paternalism or anything else like that, you aren't going to end up actually delivering human rights throughout. Actually, it just triggered a thought. In medicine, there has been this cultural problem for quite a while, and I think you'll recognise it when I say it, is that it can be quite paternalist. Doctors, certainly male doctors, historically have tended to sort of, have that powerful position and just tell people. So there's something where we need to be engaging people of all communities and their experiences, in the way in which we actually build these things out. What I don't want to see is ethics collapse into we've got an ethics board and it's got a bunch of people, and you look at it and it's like some conferences, it's all manels, or it's got no people of color in it, or any other thing. You're not going to get every single panel, every single ethics board with a totally representative mix, but we need to do a lot better and actually making sure that the people whose rights are most often in jeopardy are fully represented in the way in which we design and look at and make transparent our systems. So, are there any other questions by the way? Hopefully I've answered those ones that have come in, just checking back. There is a comment. I'm afraid I can't see that on the side, but I've been told that I need to wrap up because Aaron's got a very, very large... here we go. There we go. Okay, AI should not be validated for clinical use. The space of all possible solutions for a specific optimization will always have unexpected, unwanted outcomes. See also adversarial examples. Yes, that is absolutely true. But also in medicine, let's remember that medicines have side effects. Whatever you do to a human being, you're trying to minimize harm and keep them well, but it is understood, like with, say, chemotherapy or radiation treatment, that something that you do may have negative consequences, which we call side effects, and it's a balance. Now, I'm not saying that every AI, or any AI, frankly, should be let loose and just say, well, hey, everything has side effects. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we have to get really quite serious and sensible about what bits of medicine we can actually apply AI to. So it may be that we don't ever let an AI diagnose someone. Maybe that is something which a human can do. An AI can do statistics, but you put it in a different context and it's no good. However, an AI-controlled sort of robot arm being able to point the X-ray at the right point in the tumor may have a degree of control that is far greater than a human being. So it's think about very much where we actually use AI rather than just saying it's all the same thing. Anyway, Aaron's crook is pointing at me. Thank you very much for joining me for this talk. I've really enjoyed the forum, and I hope you have too. And I hope to continue the conversation in the coming months and coming years. Bye.